Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. The webinar will be starting in 5 minutes. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I'm the Senior Associate at SRCD and Consortium Coordinator. Welcome to today's call. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street from the county jail? Communication strategies for leveraging systems change on parental incarceration. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 35 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. A few more notes about today's event. We are using GoToWebinar to host the call. All of the attendees are muted. Attendees, please use the chat box on your screen if you would like to send in questions for our speakers. Today's webinar is being recorded. After the call ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel and will share the link with you all. If you have colleagues or friends who are not able to make today's call but are interested in the content, please share the link with them. And now I would like to turn things over to Sara Langworthy to introduce herself, our other speakers, and today's topic.
Hi everyone, my name is Sara Langworthy, and I first of all want to thank SRCD and the consortium for hosting this webinar today. We're very excited to be joining you and talking to you about this topic. We especially want to thank Patricia and Hannah for all their help in making the technical side of this happen and getting the word out about this webinar. So, we also want to remind the audience about our Twitter hashtag that we've got going today. So if you have questions that come up throughout the webinar, feel free to use the chat box in GoToWebinar, but also you can go on Twitter and use hashtag #ResearchComm if you have any questions for us either today or after the presentation. We'll be happy to answer them as we're able. So who are we? Today we're here with Dr. Rebecca Shlafer, Sara Benning, and myself, Sara Langworthy. We are all housed in 3 different places at the University of Minnesota. So Dr. Rebecca Shlafer is at the Department of Pediatrics, Sara Benning is with the School of Public Health, and I am with Extension at the university. So I want to give a little bit of background on how we all know each other and how we came together initially to highlight that who you meet early on in your career can be really important later on. So it's kind of a 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon story. About 10 years or so ago, Rebecca and I were both getting our PhDs at the Institute for Child Development at the University of Minnesota. At that point, Rebecca found Sara Benning, who was working at the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium at the time. After being trained in the approach during her time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Rebecca volunteered to help with a family impact seminar for state legislators that Sara Benning was organizing. Meanwhile, I was volunteering my time with another consortium staffer who was working with the Science Museum of Minnesota to put together an exhibit all about the science of early childhood development. I then, after completing my PhD, I joined the staff at CYFC and worked with Sara Benning. And these have been the beginnings of great, terrific working relationships among us that sparked some great projects over the years, some of which we're going to share with you today. So first of all, I wanted to start with a pro tip for all of you graduate students out there who are listening. Volunteering and networking in graduate school is so important because you really have no idea how these connections are going to play out into the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca, who can introduce herself and talk a little bit about her position at the university.
Thanks, Sara. So as Sara said, my name is Rebecca Shlafer, and I am an assistant professor in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Health, and that's in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota's Medical School. Sometimes people think, isn't it a weird place for you to be as a developmental child psychologist to have ended up in a medical school? And I do admit that most of my colleagues are MDs and not PhDs, but I've actually found this to be an incredibly rich place for me to do basic and applied research on child development and use my skills, my applied developmental research skills in this setting. Much of my funding has come at this point from a handful of internal resources at the university, including the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, which has funded my K Award. I have funding from the Program in Health Disparities Research and our Office for Vice President for Research, which has been really generous supporting for the research that I've done related to children and families affected by incarceration. I also listed Kira here. I know some folks had questions about my research or the work that we were doing, particularly with pregnant incarcerated women. And so I just want to put a nod out to the fact that the Minnesota Prison Doula Project, which I'm the research director for, is now housed at our Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, which is also at the University of Minnesota. And I think the lesson here is just that we all wear many hats in our roles, and we are interfacing with a number of different parts of the university in different ways. So I'll turn it over now to Sara, who will introduce herself a little bit more.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I am Sara Langworthy. I am with the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium, and that is housed within the University of Minnesota Extension. So historically, the role of Extension has really focused on things like agriculture, family consumer sciences, and 4-H youth programming. However, we also work to take on some of the most pressing issues facing children and families and work to connect university expertise and resources to help solve pervasive community problems. So at CYFC, we work to bring research and practice knowledge together in ways that are useful for people who are out in communities working with children and families. I'd like to point out that the University of Minnesota is a land-grant institution, and basically that means that the university is charged by the state to do research, teaching, and outreach that benefits the people of Minnesota. And Extension has historically continues to engage in the outreach portion of that particular mission. But I'll turn it over to Sara to tell you about a completely different part of the university in the School of Public Health.
Thanks, Sara. This is Sara Benning, and I do outreach and communications for the Center for Leadership Education in Maternal and Child Public Health, or MCH, as I'll be referring to it today. Although, fun fact, several years ago, I served as the Associate Director of the National Child and Family Policy Consortium, back when it was housed at Duke and before it moved over to SRCD. So I'm really familiar with the work of the consortium and its members, and I'm just really thrilled to be here with you today. I'm happy to say that my center, which is federally funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, is celebrating its 60th anniversary. And over the course of the last 60 years, we've pretty much had the same three primary tasks. And those are providing graduate education. So we've had over 600 graduates complete our program. And I'm really proud to say that Dr. Rebecca Shlafer will soon count herself as one of them. We also offer technical assistance to professionals in the upper Midwest. So that's provided by me, by our faculty, and sometimes even our graduate students. And what that TA looks like can really vary. It could include working with data. It could involve creating communications or framing for an organization. It could be program evaluation or our service on an advisory panel or a task force. So again, our TA is really varied, but I always encourage people to reach out if they have a need, and we just see what sort of capacity we have to help. Finally, we are also focused on providing continuing education to professionals. So we host or co-host over 20 educational events or trainings every year. Now you know a little bit about where we come from. We are all at the same major research institution doing our work with community and other university partners, but with really different missions, different funding sources, and different stakeholders. I think that these differences make us stronger in our reach. We're able to do so much more together than we'd ever be able to do if we were working alone. But I want to get into the nitty-gritty details of today's presentation. So something for you to note, we're using parental incarceration as an example of just one timely issue that's affecting lots of kids and families. What we hope to convey today is a deeper understanding of the importance of translating research to practice and policy, and how collaboration makes that easier and more rewarding, or at least it has for us. What I'm really talking about here is content versus process. Rebecca's content area is incarceration, parental incarceration, whereas I have a family policy background and Langworthy has a background in child development. So Sara Langworthy and I, we and our centers, we don't do incarceration. We focus a lot on a lot of different topics. although we've learned a ton about incarceration over the last couple of years. So Sara and I focus on employing different methods of research communication across a broad range of topics. Of course, this is also something that Rebecca does because she's just that kind of an academic. But what we really hope is that this presentation will offer you some encouragement to keep doing what you're doing and some practical tips regardless of your own content area. Speaking of content, I am going to hand this over to Rebecca, who's going to share a bit about what she knows about parental incarceration, which is a considerable amount.
Thanks, Sara. Thanks. And just as a quick note, I just want to acknowledge that really diving into the research today on parental incarceration is kind of beyond the scope of today's presentation. We could certainly have an entire presentation, entire conferences on children's outcomes related to parental incarceration. And I know several of you had asked questions in advance of today's webinar specific to that, sort of what are kids' outcomes or what are the best approaches to working with kids. I just want to make note of two references that are particularly valuable and things that I turn to regularly. And that's the 2010 edited volume called Children of Incarcerated Parents. It's edited by Mark Eddy and Julie Pellman. And that's a resource that I use regularly for folks who are looking for developmental research on children and families affected by incarceration. And then another is a web-based resource, the National Resource Center on Children and Families of the Incarcerated, which is housed at Rutgers. Both of those are invaluable resources, and so if you're looking for more research on children with incarcerated parents and diving into this topic a bit more, those are places where I'd begin. So that's just a quick note to sort of say that today we're not going to dive into the research so much beyond a quick overview of why this is an issue. Before we get there, though, I'd like to ask a quick question of the group, and I'm going to encourage you to use your polling option here. So the first question is, how many U.S. children have co-resided with a parent who was incarcerated? Give people a minute or so to answer here. Good. So it looks like we have a majority, about almost 50% of folks think it's that highest number, 5 million, but a third of you think it's close to 2 million, and a smaller, about another third, a little bit less than that, think less than 2 million. It's a great place to start. I'll have Sara bring the slides back up. What we know from a recent child trends analysis of the National Survey of Children's Health is that it's actually 5 million children who have co-resided with a parent who was incarcerated at some point during their childhood. This is really a tremendous number of children who have been impacted by this adverse childhood experience. And what we know is that among these 5 million children, they're disproportionately children of color, more likely to be children who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, and children whose parents have limited education or live in rural areas. And so this really, for me, over the years, has become so much of a social justice issue when we think about the disproportional impact of this adverse childhood experience on child health and development. So on the next slide, I like to think about the fact that during graduate school, I feel like I was constantly told to sort of narrow and pick a niche, right? And as you move through graduate school, you really do have to find your way and find your area of expertise. And I sort of think back to over a decade ago when I was a graduate student at UW-Madison before I came to the University of Minnesota to do my PhD. And at that time, I was working with Dr. Julie Pellman, and she was one of the first to publish research on children with incarcerated mothers. And I felt so passionate about this issue and was so engaged, and I remember thinking, this is my niche, right? This is going to be narrow enough that not everybody is doing it, and I can dive into this topic. And now, more than a decade later, it's fascinating to me to hear the way the world is talking about mass incarceration in the United States. This isn't a niche. Everyone, it's really almost impossible at this point to not turn on the news or listen to NPR or hear people talking in regular discourse about the impact of mass incarceration on children and families and communities all across the United States. And it was just this last year, right, that we saw our first sitting president visit a federal prison in the same year that the Pope visited prison. And I like to just, help people recognize that this growing attention to the issue is really being seen everywhere. And that's in part because we've just seen exploding prison populations over the last 30 years, really. So what you'll see next here is data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And what you can see, as I mentioned, is this just exploding prison population from about, the late mid-70s into the early 80s and then beyond from there. And so despite violent crime dropping during this period of time, we've seen incarceration rates increasing exponentially. And this increase has largely been attributed to changes in criminal justice policies, including mandatory minimum sentences for drug convictions. And so today, the U.S. has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's inmates. And it's costing us as taxpayers $80 billion a year. And what we know is that if we were to break this figure down by sex, by inmate sex, what we'd see is that the incarceration rate for women has grown substantially faster than the rate for men. And we also know that this increase has had profound implications for children and families. So on the next slide here, what you'll see is also data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, data from 2010, which at the last count was really data from 2007, the inmate survey. And you can see that line increasing over that period of time of the number of minor children impacted by their parents' incarceration. And at that time, back in 2007, what you see is 1.75 million children with a parent currently incarcerated in a state or federal prison. So between mid-year 1991 and mid-year 2007, the last year for which those data are available, the number of parents held in state and federal prison increased by 79%. And so as I said, in 2007, it was estimated that nearly 1.75 million children had a parent incarcerated in prison. And as you heard just a few minutes ago, we know from data from the National Survey of Children's Health that 5 million children have been impacted and have co-resided with a parent who's been involved, incarcerated at some point. And that may be jail or prison. Many families are cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, and that has an impact for children's health. So on the basis of those data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we could expect that at least half of these men are fathers, and nearly 2/3 of these women are mothers, a group that more than doubled between 1991 and 2007. But we could also see it this way, and we could think about their children. So based on the Bureau of Justice estimates, 1 in 43 children had a parent in state or federal prison, and again, that was back in 2007. And now, those data from Child Trends, that report suggested that that is as many as 1 in 14. Of course, we know that these numbers don't account, so depending on which statistic you use or which data source you're looking at, many of the numbers when we look at the number of children impacted don't account for children who have a parent currently incarcerated in a county jail. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics data are really looking at state or federal prisons and not local holding facilities like county jails, or parents who are on probation or parole, or parents who were previously incarcerated but have since been released. There was a quick question about what does co-reside mean. The National Survey of Children's Health uses that distinction to think about a child who was living with a parent at some point when the parent was incarcerated or had been incarcerated previously. So a parent or a caregiver who resided with the child who was at some point in that child's life incarcerated, just to clarify that. So what do we know about this particular adverse childhood experience and what it means for children's outcomes? And again, this is such a very broad overview, but I think it's helpful to just put it into context. So we know that incarceration often creates challenges for children and families at home, in school, and in their communities. I can't read that sentence without thinking about Uri Brofenbrenner and thinking about all of the systems in which children are impacted in their lives. We know that children may experience financial and material hardship. They often have unpredictability in their family relationships and their family structures. There are often changes in who's going to be caring for the child when mom or dad goes to prison or jail. This can impact their school relationships and their performance at school, can impact their mental and physical health. And we also know that this group of children, unlike other families who may have a parent who's been deployed or divorced, who are experiencing other disruptions in family systems, incarceration brings with it a lot of social and institutional stigma that can lead to some additional risk factors for children and families. So this is really the place where I situate my research. And what we know is that this is a growing topic of great interest to stakeholders across the country. And I think one of the real challenges that we've had in our state is simply a lack of data on this issue and a need to identify new sources of data to answer critical questions. And for me, that's been, part of it has been analyzing data that are available to sort of understand this. Part of it is collecting new data and answering new questions in different ways. And one of the things I want to share with you next is sort of what have we done here in Minnesota. So not all that long ago, the state of Minnesota had no idea how many parents were in their prison. In fact, when asked how many moms are there in Shakopee Women's Prison, or how many incarcerated men are fathers with minor children, the question was really, there was no answer. The Department of Corrections didn't know that. They were routinely being asked that question, but they couldn't answer it, and they weren't systematically collecting those data upon inmates' admission to correctional facilities in our state. And that's not unlike other states. But as a researcher, I thought, you know what, I can help answer that question. We can systematically answer that question, and that's exactly what we did. These are data from an infographic we published not all that long ago in a paper that's currently under review, looking at the rates of parental incarceration among Minnesota prisoners. And what you can see is that about 66% of incarcerated men have minor children, and 77% of incarcerated women report having minor children. And so just by quick glance, this puts us at more than 16,000 children in Minnesota with a parent who is currently incarcerated. And I think that these data are really important for us to show again, the scope of the problem in Minnesota so that key stakeholders can understand what we're talking about and how this impacts the children and families in their community. So another quick question, this is an example, what I just showed you is an example of data that I have collected, new data collection. And I'm going to ask you a quick question now, reframing. So how many Minnesota youth report having a parent who is currently or formerly incarcerated? A little bit of a different cut of the data. So we'll give you just another second or so here to get your answers in. How many Minnesota youth report having a parent currently or formerly incarcerated? Interesting. So this data surprised me too. The answer is actually 1 in 6, which I can't tell you how many times I reran this and was just absolutely startled when we looked at these data. This is an example of data where we worked, and I'll share some more about this project in a bit, to add an item to a statewide survey that was already in the field that's done every 3 years state in collaboration with our Department of Health and Department of Education, to add a question about youth experience with parental incarceration. And what we found is that 1 in 6 Minnesota youth reports experiencing the incarceration of a parent or guardian either currently or in the past. And that was incredibly startling to me and my colleagues who are working on this project. So I think I've made the case that this is a worth considering, and that we know that there are implications for children's health and development, and that it crosses multi-sectors, and that there are lots of key stakeholders. And at this point, what I'd like to do is really give you an overview, knowing that this has been a big problem in our state and other states, sort of how have we worked together in Minnesota? How are we better together? And what are the kinds of things that we have done to raise this issue into public awareness, bridging the research and communication in a number of different ways. So this is by no means an inclusive list of the work that we've done in this area, but it does do a little bit to showcase the scope of some of our work on these projects or events. And so what we've done here is tried to demonstrate for you in a very quick way sort of who were the partners. So on the right-hand side, you can see the key there, where it was the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium, Sara Langworthy's shop, the Maternal and Child Health Center for Leadership in Maternal and Child Health, Sarah Benning's shop, or what we've deemed Pediatrics here, which is where I sit. Again, going all the way back to 2012, we were working on basic research and intervention with the Minnesota Prison Doula Project. You'll hear a little bit about our Sesame Street toolkits and the partnership that we had with Sesame Street, and a large list of both publications, direct research, events, and policy work that was done to really build the case in the state of Minnesota that parental incarceration is an issue worth addressing. Sarah or Sara, do either of you want to say a little bit more about this slide?
I'll just say that it's been interesting, and we'll move into this next too, but it's been really interesting being a part of this process and coming from our different perspectives, what we all bring to the table. And that's part of the journey of the interdisciplinary work that we're doing here, using the tools that we all have and the knowledge and the connections that we all have to raise the profile on this issue. And it's been an interesting journey and lots of twists and turns, but I think it's been really powerful for us to spend this time reflecting on where we've come from and how we've gotten where we have. And so I think with that, I'll go ahead and shift to talking about what are some of the tips that we've learned through the experience of the last several years doing this kind of interdisciplinary work where we're all coming from slightly different perspectives and backgrounds. The first thing I'll say is that there are definitely more than 5 tips here, but these are some of our main takeaways from our own experience in doing this kind of work. So I first want to emphasize that doing interdisciplinary work is not neat and tidy. So as researchers and academics, we're trained to think logically and with planning in mind. So we test hypotheses and we plan out our experiments. We want everything to look like this image of this plant growing neatly in its little pot. It's in a controlled environment, you see measurable growth and outcome metrics, everything is relatively predictable, you get the drift. But sometimes we avoid working in an interdisciplinary way because, let's be real, it's really hard and it actually looks much more like this, something like utter chaos. And we often see working interdisciplinarily like a tornado of creative ideas that has little rhyme or reason behind it, and that sometimes it goes wherever the wind blows and often results in complete destruction of any semblance of the place that you were hoping to go. But in our experience, working interdisciplinarily is most successful when you can capitalize both on the strengths of that structure that we researchers and academics like, and also a bit of healthy chaos. So for us, this interdisciplinary work looks more like a river. So it has many bends and turns, and it meanders around barriers and allows other rivers to join the larger way, but also to branch out when they need to. So like the Mississippi River, because we're from Minnesota, we know what direction we're headed, and how we're going to get there will change a lot along the way. So I want to revisit this timeline again to give you, again, the sense that we've laid this out very nicely and very linearly, but what it actually looked like was much more like that river. We would go in a direction and go where the energy was and try something and work on something and see where that led us. And because we were constantly connected to each other and you know, checking in with one another on what we're working on now, we were able to kind of continue to leverage each other's strengths in a really interesting way that we'll continue to talk about here as we share some of our pro tips for interdisciplinary work. So the first one, and I'll pass this off to Rebecca to talk a little bit more about how this happened, but our first pro tip for you is to be open to an iterative, creative, and organic process.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think that you're sort of giggling thinking about the tornado, because in many ways this has been just sort of a whirlwind. And what has happened really since 2012 for us as sort of a trio has been incredibly synergistic in a lot of ways, really fulfilling, but also unpredictable. And as Sarah had said earlier, for as much as those of us as academics like predictability and sort of a plan, this has been, I would never be able to predict where we were going over the last several years. So as Sarah said, the first tip that we have for you is to be open to an iterative, creative, and organic process. So back in late 2012, I was approached by a colleague at Sesame Workshop, the nonprofit organization behind Sesame Street. They had been working on developing toolkits, resource kits for young children impacted by incarceration as part of their resilience initiative. And you can see that image there on the left-hand side. Those resources are all free and available online. My colleague Julie Pellman, who I mentioned at UW-Madison, was on the advisory committee to develop those toolkits. And so that toolkit used a lot of the research that was out there to develop user-friendly resources for children and families and practitioners. And I really just got the luck to be asked to help disseminate those resources in Minnesota as one of 10 pilot states. And that was announced back in 2013. There was a press release that went out, and they were released at the White House, which was an incredible opportunity to work with a large, well-known organization who is doing good for children and families affected by incarceration. Before that announcement in the summer of 2013, we were approached, as I said, at the end of 2012 about the fact that these Sesame Street toolkits were coming down the pike. And the person who I was working with at Sesame Workshop, Lynn Schwatsky, said, I'd love to come out before these kits come down the pike and sort of introduce this idea to your community partners and the folks that you're working with, so we sort of can generate some enthusiasm around the kits. That way when they are released, people know where they can get them and know how they can use them. And so we had this really awesome kind of planning community group meeting where I invited my colleagues from local Head Start, local community-based organizations, the Minnesota Department of Corrections. We had a group of about 30 key stakeholders who came to that initial meeting just to hear about the resource kits, with this idea that basically we would just share the information with these colleagues once it came out. I had no way of knowing that this group of people around the table would get so jazzed about this idea that they really wanted to start working together to host a community-based event where we could disseminate the kits to children and families and also do some good. Somebody around the table had said, why don't we approach the governor? Why don't we work with our children's cabinet at the legislature and make a big announcement and recognize this as an important adverse childhood experience in our state? And so what you see there in the second picture is our Commissioner of Corrections, Tom Roy, holding a proclamation from the governor of the state of Minnesota, declaring a day in 2013 as Children Affected by Incarceration Day. And we actually worked with Sesame Street to have Elmo come out. We held a big event at one of our local libraries for children and families where we had a press conference to talk about why this issue is so important. Kids could meet Elmo. We had a whole bunch of child and family friendly events. And that all felt fantastic and really wonderful. But then I also had this sort of academic in the back of my head saying, okay, now you got to write this up for publication. Now you got to talk about how you disseminated these resource kits. And over a very short period of time, we generated so much attention in our state about the resource kits that we distributed more than 30,000 resource kits to children and families and community agencies in Minnesota, which is pretty remarkable. And I think for me, this is an example of sort of where we didn't know where we were going, but with successful collaborations with community partners, we were able to do something that was greater than the sum of the parts, and just a fantastic opportunity to work together, to work collaboratively across disciplines, across stakeholders, to put something together that we all felt really good about. The next tip that we want to talk about is this idea of saying yes and showing up. So one of the things that has happened in this area of work that I do specific with pregnant incarcerated women has been around providing pregnancy and parenting services through a community-based organization that I have partnered with. I was doing that work as a researcher when I was sort of tapped by the legislature to lead a legislative advisory committee. And I will never forget that evening that I was sitting in one of our legislators' offices with several community stakeholders after a committee hearing about this topic, when the legislator turned to me and she said, well, you're at the university, you're sort of in a neutral position, how about you lead this committee? And I remember feeling like so overwhelmed that I had absolutely no expertise to lend to this issue. And of course, I know that that's not true, but I think as we're all sort of questioning our own expertise and our own ability to lead something like this, and I also felt like, can I do this? Do I know how to lead a legislative advisory committee? But the answer is yes, and I think that for me it wasn't about having to do everything. It was about bringing people together to have informed, educated, passionate conversations about a critical issue in our state around the care and treatment of pregnant incarcerated women. And that really opened up so many more collaborations with opportunities. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Sara to talk a little bit about sort of how she got to show up and say yes.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Well, we, as part of the technical assistance that I was talking about earlier, we lent Rebecca a hand in convening this group, this advisory group. So along the way, we put the group together, and another thing that we also did was to offer up part of the legislation that was worked on, resulted in some funding for a pregnancy resource guide for incarcerated mothers. And we knew that the funding wouldn't quite cover all of the costs to do that. So we offered up a graduate assistant to work with Rebecca and work with a prison doula project to develop a newly released pregnancy resource guide that can get into the hands of incarcerated pregnant women as well as corrections staff. I think one of the big points about this pro tip, number 2, around showing up and saying yes, is all about a policy window opening up. And like many things in life, it's all about timing. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept of policy windows, it's based on Kingdom's policy window theory, which focuses on timing and convergence of 3 streams: a problem stream, a policy stream, and a politics stream. So some sort of problem has to arise due to circumstances, citizen interest, all of the above. But then there's also a political will behind it, which results in policy being created, which then blows open this policy window and makes the timing for an issue just perfect. So this is probably when you're going to start seeing lots of reports in the news media. I think it's important to recognize when these windows are opening, and in order to do that, you have to have strong relationships and the ability, or at least the willingness, to be responsive to these windows. So, for example, when Rebecca came to my center and to me and said, you know, this senator is really invested in moving this forward. Are you interested in the legislative advisory committee and helping to convene that? And if we at our center would have said, no, we're sorry, can this wait 3 months until we're done with this publication or this project, we would have missed a wide open policy window. But we made it so that we were able to shift priorities, and that allowed us to be nimble and enabled us not just to take on incarceration as a policy issue, but to really dive in deeply in many unexpected and really rewarding ways. Which brings us to pro tip number 3 around making connections and sharing your information. So it's one thing to, recognizing when there's a window of opportunity to collaborate is one thing, but it's also critical to make and nurture connections. The three of us, we have a constant awareness and are really thoughtful about how all the things and the stuff that we make and do can meet multiple needs and how they can benefit different audiences and stakeholders. So we're always ready and willing and eager to share and promote the work of each other's units and each other's centers.
So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like on a regular basis. A lot of this has to do with checking in with each other. We're really working hard to co-create and share little blurbs that promote our various different pieces of work that our units are taking on. We want to make sure that we're always tagging each other's organizations and working together to determine how best to represent the partners that are involved and where things should go and how we should share them. So there are a lot of conversations around, okay, how do we best communicate this information effectively? How do we reach different audiences? And those sorts of pieces have been really important for the success of the raising public awareness around this work.
I think being proactive here is huge. So, for example, I have a little tickler on my calendar with all of the dates of when Sara Langworthy Center, CYC, sends out its monthly newsletter. So I'll send them something canned and ready to go, and they have very little or no tweaking to do. So I make it really easy for them to collaborate with me and my center. And I'd encourage you to do this as well, especially if you're lucky enough to have a communications person to do this. They would be happy to help you with coming up with some of that language and identifying places at your university to promote your work.
I think the other piece of this is also being open to new opportunities to share something that you did before. One of the things that I think we all struggle with is we get busy in doing the work that we're doing right now and sometimes forget about the work we did 6 months ago. And so always trying to keep an eye open for opportunities to share the things and the stuff that you created in the past. So one great example of this is one of the projects that we worked together on was called a Children's Mental Health E-Review, and you see the picture of that at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And Rebecca was the primary author for that publication. It's a research summary, but that also invites community authors to weigh in on their perspectives on the research and how it relates to the work that they're doing. We published that in 2013, I believe, and just recently The Atlantic cited it in an article where they were talking about parenting and incarceration and the issues of mass incarceration, and they cited that article and they linked to it. So that was a really great opportunity for us to say, oh hey, yes, we remember we have this article, we can promote it too, and we can continue to share it because the information is so relevant and valuable for people, and it gives us another opportunity to share that work.
Yeah. So making connections doesn't always result in sunshine, rainbows, and roses. There have been times when I passed along information to communicators at higher levels within the university, and it's canned and all, but they just don't bite. They have other priorities that I don't know about. What we've seen happen then, though, is that others who might be involved in a project will put out a press release. And then what was a really great newsworthy opportunity passes us by. You can work to do joint press releases, and I'd encourage you to do that. So work with your partners and work with communications folks, including university relations, to develop a release together. But do make sure that everyone involved gets credit. When you are working together on a project and someone is involved in that project isn't mentioned or their work isn't acknowledged, it can really blindside them when they read that in the news. And that's just not the ticket to building connections and maintaining strong relationships. Of course, getting the work done is primary. You know, raising awareness about incarcerated women and the impact on pregnancy and their families, that's the end goal for us. And yet we do have funders and others that we're responsible to, and that's just a fact of life. So the moral of the story here is that we can give and take credit for our good work, but that we can do that together.
So I want to move now to our tip number 4, which is using what you've already got. One of the exciting opportunities that the three of us had to come back together to do some more work together was in creating a brief educational video on the topic of parental incarceration and specifically how it affects pregnant women and their babies. Unfortunately, we aren't able to show you the video today during the webinar, but the video link is up on the screen right now, so I would recommend you just jot that down and check it out right after the webinar. It's a worthwhile investment of your time, I promise. So one of the things that we do at the consortium and that we've explored doing is what we're calling repackaging. So we have hours and hours of content from existing professional development seminars that we've held in the past. And in the past, we tended to put them up online as our full-length, hour-and-a-half long seminars. But we noticed people weren't really watching them because a lot of people, even if they're interested in the topic, don't necessarily have the time or inclination to watch an hour-long talk on something. So we decided to take some of these existing videos on topics of interest with compelling speakers and slice and dice them to create brief educational videos. So we've done this in the past with a couple of other topics like historical trauma and cultural healing and trauma-sensitive practices in schools. So in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar, you'll see that there's a handout called Educational Video 101. It's also on the screen here. And this kind of walks through the process. I don't have time to really dive into it too much today, other than to say that basically what we had to do was review hours and hours of content. And we used our qualitative researcher skills to essentially code these hours of content to pare everything down into compelling brief videos that we could then share and give the content additional legs and additional opportunities to be shared more broadly. This basically takes the power of those really great seminars and professional development opportunities that you go to and takes that content and gives you an option to share it with audiences that maybe don't have time to come to your event or can't afford to come to your event, but who would really benefit from the information. So to give you a brief idea of the scope of this, we worked with, and with generous funding from our friends over at MCH, we compiled over 12 hours of professional development video and pulled clips representative of lots of different themes and pared that down to a 6-minute and 53-second video. So basically, we did this knowing that one of the seminar videos that we had previously posted on the topic of incarceration, the one that's most viewed is about 30 minutes long, and it has 969 views to date, and that's in over 2.5 years. So that works out to about 32 views per month, which would be impressive, except for that the average view duration is only 6 minutes, which means that on average only about 20% of the total video is being viewed. But now we're seeing with this new video that we've created that it has 448 views in 4 months, so that works out to about 112 views per month. And the average duration is about 2 minutes and 50 seconds, so on average people are watching about 41% of the entire video. So we're seeing higher audience retention and higher view counts per month, which means we know we're communicating more content to people and that people are using these videos in interesting ways. So now I'd like to move on to pro tip number 5 and pass it off to Rebecca for finishing that off. Rebecca, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what just happened. Okay, I think that Sarah's example of what she had just described for pro tip number 4 about repackaging videos is another great example that we have for tip number 5 about designing it to benefit all partners. And part of that is thinking about the investments that our centers or us individually have already made into some of the training opportunities that we've put together and repackaging those videos for teaching materials in the future and saying, what do we need to do with the things that we've already created to benefit new partners or existing partners? Another example that I want to talk about with this tip is what's on the screen here. I mentioned the statistic 1 in 6 and how I had worked with our Department of Health and Department of Education to add an item about parental incarceration to our Minnesota student survey. In Minnesota, our Minnesota student survey is comparable to the CDC's version of the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. So most states have some version of our Minnesota student survey and opportunities to reanalyze data that's of important public health questions. And in our case, we were able to add a critical question about history of parental incarceration. And this wasn't by any means just me doing this work. There were lots of great community partners that were helping us scope out this question, as well as graduate students and undergraduate students who are going to help analyze these data. But we were able to add this item to an existing statewide survey. And I was excited about all of the research opportunities that could come from just adding this one question, but also realized the critical importance of needing to get this out to our community partners quickly. They wanted to know how many children were impacted, and I thought that in many ways it was not wise or smart for building my relationships, and in some ways perhaps not ethical, to sit on statistics about how many children were impacted until I could get that out in a peer-reviewed publication. Of course, as a professor on a tenure track, I know how critically important it is to get out publications. And so needing to balance our investments to benefit all partners. What you see on the screen here is 2 of the infographics that we put together with Wilder Research, a local foundation here that has a research arm, to put out infographics using the data from the Minnesota Student Survey. We did one on the topic in general, and then we had done different infographics, one on mental health, one on academic outcomes, and one on chemical health as well. And then what we did with our community partner, again with Wilder and all of the stakeholders, was bring together these community-based forums on each of these topics. What I think is really exciting about this was, again, an opportunity to turn to Sara Langworthy and Sara Benning and say, can you help us promote this work? Can you share this opportunity with your colleagues? Can you disseminate this training opportunity and really help drum up additional audiences to get people engaged in this topic in a really valuable way? And I think what's really great about this is my students and I are working on papers, peer-reviewed publications, looking at the data, the secondary data analysis, and we're also going to be writing a paper about the process of doing these infographics, community forums, and peer-reviewed publications. So again, trying to recognize the benefit and the goals of all partners and think about creative interdisciplinary partnerships where we can have folks work together in really fruitful ways. So I think at this point, we've got several minutes left. We're going to open it up for your questions. To do this, you can use the chat function or the hashtag to tweet your research questions or comments to us. Sara and I have been monitoring the hashtag. We've been a little quiet on that front, but we're happy to take questions here in the chat function of GoToWebinar on the control panel there. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I think now is just an opportunity to share. On the last slide before we flip to that, you'll see contact information for all of us. This really is a genuine notice to all of you. You're very, very welcome to send us questions or comments. I see my email address has somehow I've missed that's got a typo there. It's Shlafer002, not 012. But you can certainly look us up, send us an email, connect with us on Twitter if you have questions or would like to collaborate. That's an open invitation from all 3 of us. So maybe we can start with one question, see if we can get people who are a little maybe shy to ask a question in the chat. One of the questions that came through is how would these collaborative partnerships change if we were implementing this work or if our state was run by a private rather than a public prison setting? So in Minnesota, our Department of Corrections is a state-run system, and all of our prisons are run by the Department of Corrections. So we don't have in Minnesota, as some other states do, privately run prisons. I will say that one of our key partners in a lot of the work that we have done is our State Department of Corrections, Lee Buckley in particular, who is a staff member at the Department of Corrections, but I also have collaborators inside the prisons, have been incredible partners and valuable partners because they are beholden to taxpayers in some respects, right? I think that these partnerships and the examples that we've shared today are really possible in a private prison setting. I don't have experience with that. I think that the partnerships would work differently, and I think one of the key issues would be recognizing stakeholder priorities. So working with a private prison or a privately run prison, those stakeholders have different goals. And so I think that's a first place to sort of get on board, is thinking about where can you find shared overlapping goals and investments to work together on. All that said, even if they weren't a willing partner, I think that there are really rich opportunities to still communicate and collaborate within your institution, within your communities, to identify community-based partners that are doing work directly with children and families affected by incarceration, or whatever topic it is that you're interested in. And really build creative and collaborative relationships in that way. Sara, one of the other questions that we got, maybe that one of you would want to tackle, is based on our experience building successful partnerships in Minnesota, what advice do you have for researchers looking to do similar work in other states?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, Rebecca. We talked about volunteering your time, but I think it can be as simple as just asking for meetings. Find people at your university who are doing similar work, but who can fill in knowledge gaps. So what don't you know? What would you like to know? And just invite people for coffee, learn about what they're doing, and then ask them who else they'd recommend meeting with, so that you can form a web. And then maybe even see, as you're having these meetings, see if there might be interest in a group coming together periodically, just to talk about what you're doing. Sometimes groups want to do something. They want to be a working group. They want to complete a project. But I would just suggest being open to simply meeting regularly to share information, because it's so valuable when the right hand is knowing what the left hand is doing. And the time might come for you all to do something together, maybe write a grant, or maybe try to push some policy forward, but it doesn't necessarily have to. There really is value in coming together to share resources and to share information. And I think then the other piece of advice that I'd give is to reach out to centers. At the University of Minnesota, we have a ton of centers, which can sometimes cause some grumbling. Why are there so many centers? But we're able to be we're small oftentimes, and we're able to be nimble and responsive. So one of our purposes is to connect dots and to work across disciplines. So we're often pretty connected with what other folks and other departments are doing. And chances are centers are working pretty closely with community members. So the centers would be another good place for you to make some connections.
I think you're spot on, Sara. We have one more question that came in on Twitter that I'd like to ask, and that is, what have you found is key about communicating with practitioners and public regarding parental incarceration?
I can tackle that one. This is Rebecca again. I think one of the things, and this ties in with another question that we got, which is hurdles that need to be addressed due to the stigma attached to incarceration. And I think over the last several years, I've gotten some pretty tough skin around people's gut reactions around criminals and how people should be treated, and they're getting what they deserve. And at some point, you know, that tone, those are people's sometimes very firmly held beliefs about the justice system, which in many cases are often incredibly misguided, and people don't understand the complex pathways that lead adults and juveniles to being involved in the criminal justice system. Again, pathways of poverty, limited education, mental health, substance abuse. And so for me, part of it is, without overcomplicating the system, being aware of the fact that this is a complicated system, that many people are not working with full information about what leads people into the criminal justice system and how the justice system really operates, and coming to communication with practitioners or the public with a sense of education, and not to sort of write those people off who have different values or beliefs than I do as stupid or uneducated or unwilling to talk to. In some ways, those are the people we need to talk to even more, and trying to communicate our information about the social determinants of health and about the drivers of incarceration in ways that they can learn and grow and share that information with the people in their communities and the people that they work with.
Great. I'm sensitive to time here. I just want to say thanks to everybody for attending, and I'll turn it back over to Patricia and Hannah to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much again to everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you to all of our speakers for their wonderful presentations. If you liked today's call, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. This is the last consortium webinar for the 2015-2016 academic year, but webinars will resume in fall 2016. Join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future calls, a quarterly newsletter, as well as other job and event announcements. In my follow-up email, I will attach a copy of today's slides, and I will also include a link to today's call, which was recorded and will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.